welcome to the third Canadian Mental Health Voters League podcast. Today, I'd like to talk about the concept of political capital. The concept of political capital is one of the most overlooked ideas in mental health. Political capital, put simply, is the amount of gain or loss someone's political reputation takes in undertaking any initiative. It is the investment a politician considers most in their careers. Many people think that ideals, morals, or principles are what politicians put first and foremost. To me, this is far too naive and short-sighted for what most successful long-term politicians take into account when calculating whether to make a promise while campaigning or whether to fulfill one of the promises they made after a successful campaign. The first example of this can be seen in Trudeau's Liberal government's promise to reform our electoral system. Going into an election where Trudeau needed to pick up seats that were formerly NDP seats, as a rallying cry, he made a commitment to reform the electoral system in an attempt to win votes from people on the left who would normally vote NDP. The NDP historically are the single party who would arguably gain the most from a more proportional voting system. To anyone on the left who thought that an electoral system that would put a government in Ottawa that would better reflect the number of votes each party received, making a political promise to potential NDP and even Green Party voters that those parties would be better represented with electoral reform, was a calculated and shrewd political promise from Trudeau. He was not going to pick up far-right conservatives or make huge inroads in Alberta, so he needed to collect as many votes on the left, meaning NDP and Green fence-sitters, as possible. Now, when it comes to the actual process of reforming our electoral system, why would the leader of the party that has benefited the most historically from our current first-past-the-post system undertake a constitutional issue that was complicated, not widely understood, to undermine the electoral advantage of the Liberal brand, of the Liberal brand? The Liberals made a simple calculation that the political hit they would take on reneging this promise was less than the gain they would achieve from fulfilling the promise. It was a plain example of the political capital concept. Harper and Senate reform is another great example of this. Harper was a very long-standing, devout proponent of Senate reform, of making senators elected, a concept very popular among people who were tired of appointee after appointee being made from the Liberals, the most successful party in Canadian national political history. However, once Harper was the Prime Minister and was given the job of appointing senators, his conviction for Senate reform went by the wayside. A third prominent example, as a fine illustration of political capital in action, pun intended, is the American Republican rally to repeal and replace Obamacare. For 7 years, Republicans have been rallying around abolishing Obama's landmark legislation that Nancy Pelosi was as responsible for passing as the president himself. However, now that they are finally in the position to eradicate this menace from the American landscape, the hit each elected Republican will take from removing an entitlement many of their voters rely upon. But frankly, the process is not that simple. They're thinking of their own careers, their political capital, what it would cost them, and it's basically that simple. So why am I talking about all this? Because the entire basis of the Canadian Mental Health Voters League, this organization, is about making long-term funding and badly needed changes to the mental health system in Canada, a viable option for politicians here in Canada. Unless we as voters supply the political capital gain for our politicians, particularly in the provincial jurisdiction responsible for healthcare, people seeking re-election will not do it. This is the reality of how politics works. And this organization has been built in part to provide a meaningful source of political capital as a way of saying to our politically ambitious Canadians, mental health is a popular short-term and long-term game. If you fulfill the promises you make to the mental health community, we will vote for you. Essentially, this is kind of how we see political capital here at the Canadian Mental Health Voters League. So we need your support. We need you to follow us on Facebook and Twitter and join our organization so that we can make mental health funding a popular option for politicians who are looking after their political capital. Thanks for listening again, guys, and I look forward to delivering the next podcast.